Hey everyone, thank you for joining us today for Sustainability and Supply Chains, Navigating the ESG Landscape, a joint APQC DSCI webinar. I'd like to introduce our presenters today. First, Craig, I'll ask you to introduce yourself and DSCI.
Great. Thanks, Marissa. It's great to be here, and we've really enjoyed partnering with APQC. My name is Craig Moss. I'm a director at the Digital Supply Chain Institute and also an executive vice president at Ethisphere. DSCI is a not-for-profit that works with mostly large companies looking at the digital transformation of their supply chain. And within that, we have a special look and emphasis on the impact of ESG on supply chain transformation and performance.
Thanks, Craig. And I would echo that we've also enjoyed working with you all. It's been wonderful, great joint opportunity. I'm Marisa Brown. I'm the Senior Principal Research Lead for Supply Chain Management at APQC. And APQC, like DSCI, is a not-for-profit. We are focused on benchmarking, best practices, process and performance improvement, and knowledge management. And APQC focuses on helping organizations across industries all around the world improve their productivity and quality. So, today, what we're going to do is talk about a joint research project that our organizations undertook looking at sustainability and supply chain. So, we're going to start by talking about current trends in ESG, or environmental, social, and governance integration in supply chain management. And then we'll share some information and discuss challenges and opportunities in advancing ESG practices. And we'll round it out by looking at benefits for integrating ESG into supply chain management. Along the way, Craig and I have 3 polls where we'd really love to hear from you. We want to know what your organization and your personal experience has been. Also, please continue to use the Q&A and the chat functions all throughout the webinar. And when we can, we'll pause and take your questions. And if we don't get to them, we'll look for them at the end of the presentation. And just a reminder that this webinar is being recorded, and everyone who registered will receive both the slides and a link to the recording a few days from now. So just to lay down some foundational understanding of where the information we're about to share comes from, APQC and DSCI did a research project December 2023 through January of this year and looked with 166 global organizations at what's happening with ESG in supply chain. We really wanted to understand what the current state is and also to identify some of the emerging trends that will shape the future of the industry. So, without further ado, I will just also mention at the end of our presentation, we do have a link to the full survey report from this research if you want to look at all of the data that we gathered. But now we're going to start by talking about current trends in ESG integration and supply chain management. And we have our first poll. So let's go ahead and open the poll. And we want an answer from you all about the extent to which you agree with the statement, we have established ESG goals that are aligned with our core business strategy. And Craig, this is one of those questions, as you know, that we collected in our research project. So look forward to
Right.
see how this audience differs.
Right. And it's such a foundational part of whether it is actually integrated into the strategy or if it's ESG is like a whole separate department and a separate activity that doesn't really integrate into business. So
It's a good
I'm
point.
eager to see what the group on the call feels about this.
All right, so here are our results. Let's see.
So
38%.
we've got a pretty diverse group here, right? It's pretty even. Nothing stands out significantly. I mean, if we
Yeah.
look at it one way, we've got almost 20% that strongly agree, which is great. But the other way to look at it would be that over 50% don't really agree or disagree with it. So, uh,
That's true.
and anything else that jumps out to you on this, Marissa?
I think it's interesting that the biggest group was neither agree nor disagree, kind of right there, neutral in the middle,
Uh-huh.
which doesn't really speak to making it a strong alignment, right? If it's kind of a neutral.
Absolutely. Let's see what the data. Well, we'll get to the data in a minute, but let's go and start to share what we found in the survey. So we asked a series of questions in the survey on this topic, and we're going to go into the data in a minute and give you the actual numbers, but the highlights that we saw across the board. One is that companies recognize that it's a key element in supply chain management, and that's clearly also being driven by different factors that we're going to get into. Two, we see a pretty significant gap between acknowledging that it's important and actually integrating it into core business strategy. That's something, in addition to the survey that we did here at DSCI, we work with a lot of multinational companies and talk to them about what they're doing and the challenges they have. And that's something that we see a lot, is that it's a lot easier for a company to set a goal than it is for them to put the systems in place to achieve the goal. The next thing that we saw is that regulatory compliance and customer expectations are the driving forces. And we're going to get into that a little bit more. But clearly, regulations do drive behavior in corporations. We see that. And customer expectations. If customers are asking for it, that's something that's going to come up and companies are going to respond to. And then finally, getting back to the lack of integration, we see that strategy is not really routinely translated into specific goals and actions. So that's kind of the highlight of what we found.
Absolutely. So thanks for sharing those, Craig. And now we can start to delve down into some of the data. So on the right-hand side of the screen is the question we just asked all of you on this webinar, which is how integrated is ESG in your corporate strategy? So you can see that what we found was, and actually, I'm sorry, that's the right-hand side. And the left-hand side is the importance of ESG in terms of the measurement of supply chain practices and supply chain management practices. So what we find is that 62% on the left side consider ESG to be extremely or very important. But on the right-hand side, in spite of that, or despite that, only 19% had fully integrated ESG strategy into their business. So it's fairly close to, I think, what we saw from the webinar participants here.
Yeah, and we
Um,
did have a question came in from Alex. Can we share how many people just took the virtual poll out of the people on the call? Do we know that?
uh, we have to follow up afterwards. I don't have that information now that we closed the poll. So,
Oh, 16. Maria just put it up. 16 took
okay.
part in the virtual poll.
Okay, thank you.
But you're right, Marissa. The numbers are really very similar between our virtual poll and what we found in the larger survey of 160 companies, 160 plus companies.
Yeah, so what we're seeing is that there's a recognition of the importance, but it's not yet fully translated into integration. Now
Yeah.
let's just take a look, if we will, here. Oh, hold on. We got another question in from Bob. He says, I see serious issues around why ESG is a valid approach. The goals seem worthwhile, but who is benefiting who around ESG? Do you want
So,
to? Mhm.
yeah, sure. So, Bob, that's a really interesting question. So, the benefit, I think you have to look at it in different ways. And I think that the slide that Marissa has up here kind of starts to hit at it. Why are companies paying attention to this? They're paying attention to it because their customers are asking about it, and partly because of the regulations, the increasing amount of regulations. If you look at across the board behavior of a large company in a supply chain, so I've done work with some of the largest brands and retailers in the world. If they start to put requirements in to their agreements around environment or social or human rights issues in the supply chain, that causes action among the companies that are suppliers. Because if you want to be a supplier to that big brand or retailer, it means you have to start to take these things more seriously and take action about it. So I think that that is, in the short term, to your question, I think that the who benefits are the participants in the overall supply chain, whether it's the final customer or the participants, because it starts to elevate or raise all the boats together as conditions start to improve. I hope that addressed your question. And if not, feel free to follow up with me after.
Thanks, Craig.
Marissa, you want to cover this slide?
Yeah, sure. So what we wanted to understand is where are the drivers coming from? Who's pushing for ESG in terms of the strategy that companies are developing? And we see the top three, as Craig just alluded to, is customers in the number one spot, followed by regulators and investors. And increasingly, I mean, there was pressure coming from multiple sources on companies to achieve these goals and to have these strategies. One of the things that, it's not just enough to have the strategy, it has to actually get executed. That's where a lot of the challenge comes in. But there's a critical link here when we look at both customer demands and the regulatory mandates that link market demands, risk management, and compliance.
So from here, I think we can start to dig into some of the goals that have been established. And I thought this was really an interesting result here. And when we asked about, has your organization established goals on the following topics, the thing that jumped out to me a lot here was that despite all the talk about carbon emissions and some of the new regulations on carbon emission reporting, that it's only at 58%, whereas things like ethical business practices are at 75%. And I think in part, if when I break this down to the next level, and we do a lot of work on these topics at Ethisphere also, in addition to DSCI, ethical business practices, people are probably thinking about things like anti-corruption programs. Um, and those have been around for a long time. You know, some of the UK Bribery Act laws, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act law, those have been around for a long time. So I think companies have had more time to try to put programs in place to measure that and start to set specific goals. The social is interesting too, because here, if you look at some of the human rights in the supply chain issue, which kind of spans down to the sustainable supply chain practices, those have been around for a long time, but more on a voluntary basis. If you look back at like the some of the early work done by Nike or Levi's or Gap related to human rights in the supply chain, at the time that was all voluntary. Now that's becoming a regulated issue also. You got the Wager Fair Labor Protection Act in the US. You have the German Supply Chain Transparency Act. You've got the new, sorry, CS Triple D that's going to become a directive in Europe. All those things are making that more regulated. Marissa, over to you to hear what your thoughts on this slide.
Yeah, and we kind of were bouncing around. Is it that maybe it's a little easier for some of these social and governance focused kind of goals because it's a policy change versus necessarily requiring some physical changes? But I think what we saw here was that there were some surprising differences by region in terms of where the top goals kind of fell out. So Europe and the Americas, ethical business practices were at the top, whereas in Africa and the Middle East, surprisingly, we saw social inclusion and diversity goals at the top, and Asia Pac had waste reduction and recycling. So it's not a one size fits all. Industry plays a role, and so does region and where organizations are located.
Yeah, that is an interesting part. And I think this also gets back to the strategy piece. And we're going to come around to how like the benefits of integrating it into strategy. But I think this comes around into that is it makes sense to focus on the elements that are most relevant to your business.
Absolutely. And well, I see we have a few more questions that have come in. So let's see. Wow, it's a long question. I think that we'll circle back to your question, Bob, toward the end of the webinar, but everyone, please do continue to put your questions in. Thank you for doing that. Um, let's look a little bit at challenges and opportunities in advancing ESG practices. And here we're going to have another poll. And this time we want to look at the number one challenge that your organization is facing when it comes to implementing ESG in your supply chain. Is it cost, lack of reliable data, conflicting stakeholder demands and priorities, lack of resources, or limited internal expertise in ESG? So please take a moment and share your thoughts with us.
And then we'll show you a little bit about what we heard from the survey, and then also some of the underlying thoughts behind it that we have, and some of the what we hear from companies that we're talking to on these topics.
Absolutely. All right, so take a moment and now let's see what our poll results look like.
Wow, so here again, we have quite a spread on this one too. Interesting. Limited internal expertise is really right up there with the data.
Yeah.
Um, it's interesting here to see that cost is at the lower end as being a barrier. And of course, Marissa, if we break this down, like carbon reduction, cost there is going to be more of a factor to the point you made than it would be on improving social conditions in the supply chain. Tends to might be more of a policy type of issue or an auditing issue as opposed to something that would require a lot of capital investment.
Yeah, no, this is quite interesting. Um, so let's see how this compares with what we found in our research. All right, Craig, you want to take us through our key highlights in this section?
Sure. So we found in the larger survey that cost and a lack of reliable data were the biggest hurdles. The other thing that we see, and we're going to get into this in a minute, is the whole supplier selection process. And the supplier selection process, to me, if you're trying to improve ESG in your supply chain, that means inherently that you are involving third parties in your ESG program. And we saw a lot of inconsistency in whether that's integrated into supplier selection. And that's a real operational issue there. The next thing we did see is that employees need new skills and knowledge. And we saw that that was another gap that people pointed out. And finally, on the positive side, we do see companies starting to think that it's going to help them with an enhanced reputation and a competitive advantage. And that competitive advantage piece, we're going to come back to that in a minute. But I think that is such a critical element to this to start to think about how, as an organization, you better integrate ESG into the organization, but then start to use that as an advantage in the marketplace, depending on who your customers is. And the other thing I want to say here is that if you look at ESG, there are a lot of topics in there, right?
Yeah.
It's not, there's not one E topic, one S topic, one G
Yeah.
topic. There are a lot of topics. And part of what companies need to do is they need to be able to prioritize which topics within those three buckets are most relevant to them and are going to be most beneficial to their place in the position in the market.
Excellent point. Excellent point. And I see we've gotten a few comments here. Cost management would logically flow from prioritization. Yeah, certainly. I mean, depending on what you choose to do, that is definitely going to drive where your costs go. We got a thumbs up on supplier selection. And then a comment from Alan, thank you, about ESG needs accurate business value, ROI, or profit to convince if this journey makes sense.
Right. And Alan, we are going to get to that at the toward the end. We see some really interesting findings related to that.
Absolutely. So here's what we heard from our 166 research participants. So the top challenge, top two really, was cost and lack of reliable ESG data from suppliers and partners. which is very similar to what we just got from the webinar poll participants. And then we see it drops down to 33% saying conflicting stakeholder demands and priorities. Excuse me, followed by lack of resources. So, and then comes the limited internal expertise. So slightly different overall picture than what we just saw from today's webinar attendees. But I think that aside from cost, which as was rightly pointed out, will flow from where your priorities are, the lack of reliable data from the suppliers and partners is a big obstacle that partly stems, I think, from the fact that there's not today one universal truth, one universal standard, one universal understood. Here's how to calculate this, here's how to report this. And so everyone's having to work with their suppliers and up and down the supply chain to kind of figure out how to do it all, everyone all together. But also, Craig, did you want to look at what's sort of at the bottom of the list here, where people kind of,
Yeah.
not as many folks had.
Yeah, I think here it's interesting. Now the question was looking at top three, but when I think at the bottom here, resistance from suppliers to adopt the practices required, resistance from internal departments. In the work I do with companies, and at Ethisphere, I've led some ESG working groups with dozens of multinationals. I think these are far bigger issues in terms of how things get operationalized. I think in this survey, they're being underreported. They might not be a top three challenge that comes to mind, but I do see a lot of resistance from suppliers because you might be told by a buyer, I need you to maintain the same price that you gave me last year, and I need you to cut carbon emission, or I need to maintain the same price and I cannot allow your workers to work excessive overtime. Those are the kind of trade-offs that come up in the real world. And I think if we dug a little bit deeper into this, we would see that there is more resistance among the suppliers and internally. Because I also see in companies, there are a lot of conflicting performance incentives in companies that often come up. My performance measurements might be conflicting with yours, like between the ESG department or the supply chain or the procurement department. So it'd be interesting. And actually, Marissa, we're doing that, as you know, we're doing that follow-up survey later in the year. And these are becoming some of the things I think we should kind of dig into a little bit deeper. It would be really interesting.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, so there's a lot of obstacles or challenges when it comes to this. Oops, hold on. I think I skipped a slide. There we go. But we had talked about using ESG for supplier selection. So here's our question about how often do organizations use it? And we can see that only 13% said always and 30% most of the time. So there's 43% right there that are regularly applying ESG as a criteria for supplier selection. But then we saw that 62% earlier said that ESG is important in their supply chain, but only 43% are using it when it comes to select suppliers, which says that there's a little bit of a gap here where we can better align practices with stated values. And I think that underlies a lot of the ESG related concerns in many cases. I know we've all seen these, net zero promises and a little bit of greenwashing. Maybe that's kind of happening. And so it's vital that companies back up what they say with what they do.
Absolutely. And, especially if you think about with the carbon issue, scope three emissions account for typically 80+% of a company's carbon emissions. So you do need to be paying attention to that. The other thing is with the human rights issues in the supply chain and the supplier due diligence laws, now are legally required in a lot of countries around the world, Canada, Japan, the US, EU, you're required to conduct due diligence on suppliers. So that's part of the supplier selection process. And most of these laws now go a step further. And not only are you required to conduct due diligence pre-contract, but you're required to monitor their performance and to help them to remediate or make sure that they've remediated any things that you've identified. So that really creates a different dynamic between the buyer and the supplier. And this supplier selection is going to be critical. This also takes internal coordination that might not be happening now, because if we get back to the metrics, if the procurement part, the people are only being measured on cost and on-time delivery, and then the ESG people try to insert other criteria into supplier selection that could make the cost go up or reduce the likelihood of on-time delivery. There's going to be internal conflict around those things. So it's really important that companies align internally so they're then able to send that clear, consistent message to the suppliers.
For sure. And are you seeing that larger companies now are more willing to work with and coach, mentor, help, and support some of their smaller suppliers that may not have the resources to do that on their own?
Yeah, we do see that a lot. Some of the companies in some of the industries that have been at this for a long time, like apparel and footwear, some of those companies have very sophisticated programs to help to address the issues that they see in their suppliers. We see this also in the electronics industry, where it makes sense. The other thing to think about is from the supplier side, if I'm a supplier to in the apparel industry to one big brand or retailer, typically I'm going to be a supplier to 5 to 8 other big buyers. I'm not sole sourced usually. And the same in electronics. It's usually not sole source. So what benefits the supplier is to start to elevate their systems internally so they can meet the requirements of multiple customers.
Good point. Good point. So now that brings us to our employee question, or the employee knowledge of how to execute or understanding how to execute the ESG strategy. And this was one that came up pretty high in our webinar poll. And we see here that a majority, 76% of our respondents, acknowledge that there is a significant gap in the employee's knowledge or understanding that's needed to execute the ESG strategies effectively. And I think we've been saying that strategy is not enough without execution, and they have to figure out how to operationalize those public commitments or legal and regulatory requirements. And I think one of the underpinnings for this gap is that we found that only 38% of organizations are considering capital requirements, and only 37% are considering available human resources when setting their ESG goals. So, how exactly are they going to achieve those goals if they don't have the people or make the capital investments to get there?
Yeah,
Anything you want to add on this one, Craig?
yeah, no, I think you brought up a key point there. And I think for companies also, part of it is at the same time you're integrating ESG into supply chain, you're also probably going through some kind of digital transformation. And we see from the digital transformation side that companies are challenged with upskilling the current employees or bringing on new types of talent that they need. So I think that's part of the overall decision for companies is whether to upskill people. Um, and the other thing that this one points out to me a lot, Marissa, is, and we see this in a lot of different compliance in ESG topics, is the need for cross-functional collaboration inside the organization so that it's not siloed, like it's not supply chains in a separate silo. And in a lot of organizations, we actually see within supply chain, there are other silos. You
Yeah.
know, the logistics people are in a silo, the product planning people are in a silo. So all of this points to the fact that as you integrate more factors into the supply chain management, you do really have to focus on that kind of cross-functional collaboration. And that in and of itself is a new skill set for
That's
people.
true. That's true. And that is one of the top two barriers that we have found year after year in our supply chain priorities and challenges research is this lack of collaboration. And it's actionable. There are proven practices how to break those barriers to collaboration and break the silos, but it's kind of human nature, I guess. And so it is something that companies have to actively work against or work to improve.
And Marissa, I think that gets back to the thinking about performance incentives too. And how do you measure the performance of people? If you can tell me 100 times that I'm supposed to like collaborate more with you, but if nobody changes my performance evaluations to include that in the evaluation, I'm still probably going to pay attention to what I'm getting evaluated on for my job, especially if there's a bonus tied to it.
Oh yeah. What's measured is what matters, right? That's
Right.
been proven time and time again. So
So,
now let's talk. Oh, go ahead.
no, sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was gonna say let's talk about the reliable data question. I think this is a big one here.
Yeah, this I think is one of the things that if I were in the supply chain department, I would be really focused on this one also. Because as the reporting becomes more regulated, as the big four and other firms are now starting to have like ESG auditors, just like they have financial auditors, they're starting to have ESG data auditors. Reliable, accurate data becomes more and more important. It becomes part of what you're going to have to do to provide credible reports, both to the government, to investors, to consumers. So this to me is really a challenging area. Only 5% agree that they get reliable, accurate data.
Yeah,
And that to me
strongly
is
agree.
like that would be something that would keep me up at night. And I think that there are different ways to go about this as to try to address this problem. But I think technology is one piece, but I think the other piece is going to be around a different mindset with strategically sharing data with other organizations. Um, why do you need it from them? It can't be a one-way street. You might need to give them something back, some kind of data back that's helpful to them. And actually, at DSCI, we're doing work with Harvard Business School on a framework for strategic data trading. And we'll be publishing some stuff on that. And Marissa, that's something we'd love to talk to you guys more about at APQC also. But this to me is something that has to be addressed by companies. And whether it's carbon data, which is, more tangible, the other thing would be looking at um, data related to human rights in the supply chain. All of these things become important data points that you have to collect, but it has to be reliable and accurate.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're seeing increasingly in some of the research we're doing also that the notion of a supply chain is an ecosystem, where everyone is a part of it. It's not just a linear chain like historically we thought of. It's a multi-dimensional group of organizations all kind of, rowing the boat in the same direction, if you will. And so it's vital that the data be reliable because that's the foundation for all the decisions that then get made down the road.
And related to that, I was on talking with a chief supply chain officer at a very large company, and we were talking about visibility and transparency. And what he said is, in his mind, if you start to boil it down, what does visibility mean? It means getting accurate data, right? Because if you have 10,000 or 20,000 suppliers, what visibility is getting the data that you need that you can count on from those suppliers being fed up to you in a way that you can take action on it. And I think that's a key thing. I'm on the board of the Association of Professional Social Compliance Auditors. And this is the organization that qualifies auditors to do human rights audits around the world. And I think last year there were roughly 200,000 audits done by these certified auditors. The data coming from that is really critical in helping companies know what to do, right? So, but if, and being able to count on that is absolutely critical. So, like, is the challenge that you have, is it an excessive working hours uh, challenge in a factory, or is it a forced labor challenge in a factory? You don't know what to do unless you can trust the data coming into you. And so that's why, like with APSCA, they're through this training and certification, they're trying to create more credible data coming in to the brands and retailers so that they're able to take action appropriately.
Oh, that's very valuable, very valuable. And one of the things you mentioned was about technology and whether or not emerging technologies can help achieve these goals. And here we see people a little more positive than on some of the other questions. We see 21% strongly agreeing that emerging technologies will transform how supply chain participates in achieving ESG goals through better transparency and traceability. And we see another 40% somewhat agree on this particular question. And I think this is where we have opportunities to leverage things like AI for identifying patterns or helping to predict some emerging risks using the accurate data that hopefully we're able to get, that reliable data that you were just discussing. Anything you want to comment on technology?
Yeah, I think again that this is going to be one of the enablers that would help you to get it. But I think I still kind of go back to making sure that the data is reliable and accurate. The technology certainly will help you to collect it, to be able to process it, to be able to analyze it more effectively. But I think it kind of goes hand in hand with the other piece of how do you make sure that it is reliable and accurate data that you're getting is
Right,
is
right.
is really a key piece from my point of view.
It's that old saying about garbage in, garbage out. If the underlying data is not good, then, you know, that's
And
it.
we
That's the end of
have,
the story.
Marissa, we do have a question that came in from Marcel. In which industries is the gap between ESG strategy and execution the smallest? Do we have that from some of the deeper dives?
We do have that. I don't have it at my fingertips, but we'll be happy to follow up. And we can put it in the follow-up email and let everybody know what that looks like.
That sounds great. Oh,
We,
and also just for everybody on the call, also, we will be writing a follow-up blog with some additional analysis. We also have some interesting analysis on um, by position or level in the organization that I thought was kind of interesting, related to things like importance of ESG in supply chain, looking at it from a senior exec versus a director or manager level. And we saw some really, really interesting variations in that Marissa and I are going to be writing about a little bit later.
yeah, absolutely. And so this brings us to the section on benefits of integrating ESG into supply chain management. And warm up your fingers. It's time for our last poll. This is our poll where we want to know to what extent you agree with this statement. We integrate our ESG performance into how we present our competitive advantage to customers. So again, pick one, strongly agree, agree, neutral, disagree, or strongly disagree. I'd like to know what you think about how you integrate ESG into how you present your competitive advantage to customers. All right, this is your last poll, so get your answers in. All right, we can go ahead and close the poll and let's see what we got. Well, majority of folks are neutral, neither agree nor disagree, almost half. And then 27% strongly agree. Then after that, it wasn't very much agree, disagree, or strongly disagree. So
Uh-huh.
that's interesting.
Yeah, well, they strongly agree. I mean, congratulations to those on the call that feel that way about their company. That's a good thing. And that means that it is actually being integrated into your strategy and being implemented, which is a great thing. The rest of the results are not surprising, um, really at
Okay,
all.
so we'll close that and let's take a look. So we asked, what opportunities does your organization see in implementing and integrating ESG performance criteria into your supply chain management? And so these are some of the top benefits that organizations see here. Number one was enhanced brand reputation, followed by competitive advantage, meeting regulatory requirements, and then increased customer or consumer demand. So I'm going to keep this in mind as we go to our next slide. But before we go there, is there anything you want to say here on this particular one, Craig?
Yeah, I think that the competitive advantage and the brand reputation really go hand in hand to me. And I think getting back to what we'd mentioned earlier, companies do have to pick where within ESG they want to excel. It's not, you can't do it across the board. And this is public stuff. So I'm not saying anything that's private from clients I work with. But if you look at a company like Patagonia or Timberland, they have focused on environmental issues as one of the key things to focus on for ESG because it's a core value to their customers. Outdoor, I want to be outdoor, protect the outdoors. Makes sense. Conversely, Apple has focused on data privacy as a core issue within the ESG spectrum. It makes sense to them. It would not make sense for Timberland or Patagonia to say we're best at data privacy. They can be good at it. You don't want your information stolen if you buy off their websites. But the point is, pick the things within ESG that are most important to your customers, excel at those, and then that is how it becomes a competitive advantage. And we see this in a lot of cases where companies don't pick the things that are core to them. So they spend a lot of time and energy focused on something that might be a popular topic. It might be in the newspaper a lot, things like that. And they pick a topic that is not really core to their customer base. And I find this to be something that's just like a wasted opportunity for companies.
Very good point. So that brings us to looking at internal alignment.
So with this, Marissa, we pulled together some different bits and pieces of data throughout the results. And this to me is really interesting. And it kind of gets at the point. I think one of the questions earlier was about return on investment. This to me gets at the point that ESG should be repositioned as a value creating strategy. And if I'm going to break it down a little. So if you look on the left, cost was a top challenge. Okay, I get that. So people said, yeah, the cost. So that means they view it as a cost center. Then I look at only 25% said it has revenue generating potential. Yet 51% it would increase customer demand. That generates more revenue. So to me, it's purely at this point, part of the issue is a terminology issue. It's thinking of ESG as a cost, not a possible revenue generator. Yet they do say that it would actually help them to get more customers. And they say it would give them a competitive advantage. If it gives you a competitive advantage and it increases customer demand, it is giving you more revenue, fundamentally is giving you more revenue. So this to me points at that need for better internal alignment to start to think about this more as integrating into our core strategy as part of value creation and not think of it as a separate cost element.
That's a great insight right there, Craig. Excuse me. So an investment versus a cost. So, um, and I think also one of the key takeaways we saw overall is that there were still 20% of the participants in our research who don't even have an ESG strategy yet. And I think that what we're seeing from all the data and from everything that's happening in the world out there is that you're going to be handed one by your regulators or by the laws or even your customers. And so it's always better to be proactive versus reactive and focus on your strengths and what makes sense for your business and not be last to the party. I did want to mention that we do have the full report available to everyone, including the demographics of the participants and all the questions that were asked. And we will be sending these slides to everyone who registered. So now let me pause and see what other questions we've received. Um, one comment, I guess, not a question, was that often they see multiple sources of benchmark data or program resources, making it feel like compliance is not clear. And that I think is the lack of one unified global standard on some of these things that might be happening. Craig, anything you want to say about that?
Yeah, sure. Bob brings up a really good point here, and there are a lot of different standards, both industry standards, and also topic-specific standards. So what I see some companies doing is they tend to selectively use bits and pieces from different standards to kind of align better with their business, but also to better align with where they think they're going to show better. If I use this standard, I'm going to look like I'm mediocre, whereas if I use this standard, I'm going to look like I'm good. So I do see a lot of that type of mixing and matching, a little bit of this standard, a little bit of that standard. Um, the other thing that I see right now with companies is in response to the greenwashing that you mentioned earlier, Marissa,
Mm.
is companies are pulling back on their amount of public reporting. And they're doing it for a couple reasons. One is years ago, when everybody was rushing to set goals, they were setting goals that clearly they did not achieve, and that in many cases, they never really had the systems in place to try to achieve the goals, to be able to. So they started to catch flack around that, both either consumer or media pressure, or there have been some greenwashing lawsuits coming out and fines from regulators. So what I see with some companies is they're pulling back on the reporting
Mhm.
and wisely, in my opinion, starting to do first and then talk, as
Yeah.
opposed to before, it seemed like everybody was jumping to talk first and then maybe trying to do something to catch up.
Absolutely right. Yep. We had actually started a timeline of all the companies who said they'd be net zero by 2030, 2035, and we were going to come back in 5 years, 10 years to see who actually got there because it was the time when that's what everybody was promising. But you're
Right.
right. You got to do first and then you can report. So one other question that we have, and I do want to encourage everyone to put their questions into the Q&A or even into chat, either one is fine, is that we said there's a gap between acknowledging the value of ESG and actually integrating it into strategy and operations. How do you see that gap closing? Is that internal or external efforts? And I'll answer that and then feel free to chime in there. But I think it's both. It goes back to the entire ecosystem needing to be a part of that. And internally, I think it's very important, as we mentioned, to set achievable, actionable goals, not just at the top, but figure out how to cascade those down through all the levels of the organization and provide the resources to make it happen. And then I think working with employees on understanding and improving their understanding of how to execute the strategy, whether it's through training, formal or informal, engagement. You mentioned earlier change management. That's one of the important tenets of change management that people support what they're a part of. And you want it to be a we, not a you, right? An us, not an us versus them kind of mindset so that it can be incorporated into the way they work. And then I think from an external perspective, we're seeing that regulations and laws and changes in those are really strongly driving organizational behavior. And I think that looking at that ESG data from getting reliable ESG data from your suppliers and your partners speaks to, again, this need for a strong collaborative ecosystem and figuring out how to get that data in a way that works for all the parties involved. To your point earlier about some of the data trading that might be happening. So those are just a couple thoughts there, but anything you would want to add?
I I think you covered the topic really well, but and to highlight some of the things you said, it to me it goes back to the need for internal collaboration and internal consensus around some of these things. I've seen a lot of companies where a certain ESG goal, whether it's water consumption or energy conservation or whatever it would be, gets set by people that don't actually have control over achieving that goal. And then they try to push the goal out. So if you're sitting at headquarters in the US and you're setting a goal that you can never achieve unless you get your subsidiary in India and 50 suppliers in India that work with your subsidiary to go along with it, you're crazy to set the goal without the at least your subsidiary's participation in it. And too often goals are being set at headquarters and being pushed out to operating units, and that it's not won't work. If it does work, it's a painful, long, slow process. I think you need to get the different departments and stakeholders involved in the goal setting process so that you're able to set goals that are practical and realistic. We want
Mhm.
ESG to be integrated into how you operate. And to do that, you really need to get the input, not only internally, but then who are the key suppliers that are going to be involved in this? And I think that that's really the way of the future. And Marissa, you mentioned it as an ecosystem. At DSCI, we call it creating constellations of value among an organization and their suppliers. I think that's the way of the future. The other thing it does point to is it points to typically a reduction in suppliers. A lot of companies that I see have feel that they have too many suppliers. And I think that the ESG initiative and that supplier selection process associated with it can be a valuable tool in reducing the number of suppliers to a level that's more manageable and appropriate for what you're trying to accomplish.
That's a good point. It's a good point. We have another question here from Alan about renewable energy, specifically solar. And he says short-term benefits are widely shared, whereas very little has been released on long-term implication, like solar panel disposal, which has hazmat metals, which get into our streams. He's asking if we have any information on that about the 25-year-ish lifespan expected on most solar panels. Is that something that that's not something I have any additional information on, but Craig, what about you?
No, nothing that I have. But Alan, that brings up a really good point is as the transition to renewable energy, it's also with the batteries for electric cars too.
Yeah.
So I think you bring up a really valuable point there. And Marissa, that might be something we want to start to think about adding something on that into our next survey too.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I do want to invite all of you to connect with Craig and with me, with our organizations, to continue sharing your questions and your thoughts because this isn't the last research we'll be doing on this for sure. We'll continue to explore ESG. Just a couple reminders. I want to be aware of everyone's time today on this call. Everyone who registered will get a copy of the slides and the recording. And we do have a short little satisfaction survey we would appreciate you taking when the webinar closes. And then you can also view any past webinars on demand. But here is contact information for both Craig and for myself. We do look forward to continuing the conversation, and you can connect with us and our organizations through your social media of choice, LinkedIn, X, our blogs, whatever you choose. So, with that, Craig, I want to thank you so much for sharing your insights and your thoughts on this topic. And I want to thank all of you for joining us on today's webinar.
Thanks so much, Marissa, and thanks to all of you for joining us.
Thank you, everyone, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.